I'd like to do is pick my way through, not that one, that's a later video, hang on, let me find a blank sheet of paper, is formatting. There's a very useful method which we use when we're outputting data. So we use it with the print, and it's called dot format. And it's quite tricky to get used to, but actually it's better to show you an example to show how it works. But it's a very important thing to be able to do, because you can control the appearance of your data. So if I just very briefly, I'll get that out of the way, have a look at this example here. Let's say that I do some calculation and I've worked out that Fahrenheit is 32 and the corresponding Celsius, and I want to output something like this. The Fahrenheit, or something like this. Da-da-da-da-dum-dum, right? Something Fahrenheit converts to something Celsius. And I want to output that string, and into these brackets, they're just kind of placeholders. I want to place the actual values that I get from my calculation, right? Now, this is where formatting comes into it. So there's two concepts here. The first is I have some values that I want to put in a print statement that ends up being 32 Fahrenheit converts to 0. But I don't want to write the numbers 32 and 0 here and put them in a print statement. I want to use the variable. So let's just break the problem down a bit. Let's say I have a print statement, and in that print statement I say, right, I'm gonna hard code it 32 Fahrenheit. I'm going to shrink the language, convert to 0 Celsius. Okay, now if I ran that, that's okay, because it kind of displays what I want it to display, but it's only this particular print statement fixes the values that I want to output. I'm just going to do this as a starting point, okay, in this particular problem. So let's just run that. Let's see it display. Right, and it says that. Now, I actually don't want that number 32. I want that variable. What's inside whatever the calculation gives me, and I want that from the Celsius variable. Okay, so I don't want this in the string. So how do I actually do it so I can insert the values from two variables? So let's flick very, very quickly at the lecture slides. There's a nice little conversion thing I'm going to just show you. We use a curly bracket to make this work. Okay, so let's come back here. So instead of writing 32, I would write curly bracket. Right, get rid of the 32. Right, and you think, okay, what's curly bracket doing? I'm not quite sure what you're doing, Nad, but I'll stick with it. Another pair of curly brackets. Let's get rid of that 0. Right, so in order to make this work, I have to now, so let's say those curly brackets are placeholders, and I need a clever mechanism to insert the variable values into those locations. So I do dot format, and in the sequence I want them inserted, I would put the values. So I would take the variable Fahrenheit, and I'd put it inside this format statement, and if I want the variable Celsius, I'd put it afterwards. Okay, I'll spell this out. We'll go through this in a minute. Let's make a bit more space. So there's my print statement. There's the first placeholder. There's the second placeholder. Let's get rid of, got too many gaps. Dot format. The string ends there, starts and ends there. We'll pick our way through it. Format. Inside the bracket for the format, I pass it the first variable Fahrenheit. That will take the first place, and the Celsius take the second. Let's see what happens when we do that. And does that really solve the problem, right? So I'm not hard coding it. I'm doing it with variables. Look at that. It has taken the first value here, Fahrenheit, inserts it into here. It takes the second value and inserts it into the second placeholder. So if I just test it, let's just test it. Let's say I'm going to make up these values. So do apologize. Let's say 33 and it's 1 degree Celsius. Obviously is a little bit inaccurate, right? But let's just see it work. Okay. And then we'll pick our way through it. So what we're talking about is, there we go. That's neat because the output is all nice and tidy. And what we've done is we've used something called a format function. So let's explain very briefly how it works. And then I can leave you with some variations into play. Right, so what you have is a string, right? And after the string, you have the method, the function called format, and you have a bracket. Now, if inside the string I have one of these curly brackets, I have one there, I have one there, and I have one there. For sake of argument, I'm going to say that's the first one, that's the second, that's the third, 0, 1, 2. Right, and that's a bit of text, and it's all in the string. Over here, I have to have one value corresponding to that. One there, next one, and the third one there. And that's how essentially the format function works. Let's do the example I've just written down now. Okay, let's get rid of that. And very crudely, again, terrible choice for variables, but this is just for demonstration purposes. And I've got C, and I've got 78.56. In fact, let's put some decimals in, because what you're going to discover is that you can format this in many different ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a string, and I'm going to say something like this: open close string, and I'm going to insert the variables into the string, and the string is going to say something like a curly bracket, comma, b, those curly brackets, comma, c, colon, comma, bracket. Then all I'll do is I'll insert a, comma, b, comma, c, which are the actual variables, and then I'm going to print s. Right? So there are my three values, which I've done through calculations, mathematics, whatever. That's a string, which is going to be an output string, right? So we could call this output string. So I've defined what that string is. I've defined the structure of that string. These curly brackets represent that first one will get the grab first one, second will grab the second, will grab the third. That's a very simple way of inserting into a string number variables. So let's just do that, right? And there you go. Can you see that? If I just drag that over, you'll see it's all in one line. And that's an output string where the number 34.56 is got from the variable and it's dropped it into that placeholder. So these are placeholders. You can number them, and that's also what people do, right? And do that, which is essentially just reinforcing the sequence in which you're doing it. 0 is always the first, 1 is the second, and so 0 is the first variable, that's the second variable, and the third, right? So it's just another variation on that, right? Same as before. But now we come to a really interesting problem. Okay, we come to an interesting problem because if we scan our way through here, you'll notice is Matthew has much more complex stuff going on inside that bracket. Okay, he's got this 7.2f. He's got this going on. He hasn't just left that little squiggly bracket with a single number. He's actually got a single number, a colon, and he's put 7.2f with a small f, and they've all gone inside the curly bracket. Hang on a second, you'll say to me, that's really complicated. Well, let's work out what's going on, okay? What Matthew says is that the 0.2 tells you how many decimal places, the 7 tells you to use 7 characters. Now, let's actually code it and discuss it. At the moment, they just simply say, that's the first item, that's the first variable. That's the second item, that's the second variable. Notice, let's make this a little bit more complicated. Let's add a few more decimal points, right? Let's say the first thing I want them to all to have is 2 decimal places, right? I can leave that 0 in or I can take it out. But if I put a colon inside there and I go 0.2f, it says 2 that's its language of saying insert that variable in there with 2 decimal places. Let's do the same with here, 0.2f. Let's leave C as it is, right? I want to shift that over, right? Let's leave C as it is and see what happens to this code. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time doing this because really you do need to play with this. The concept is just all about formatting and characters. Have a look at that. 34.57, so it's given you 2 decimal places for that one. For C it hasn't. So let's pop one into C. 0.2f. Now it's quite tricky because the syntax, the way it looks, isn't obvious at all. And don't be surprised that you think, oh my goodness, I'm not going to remember it. Look at that, 2 decimal places for each of them. Now what I would say initially is, if you're always going to keep these three placeholders in the same sequence these numbers appear, then just get rid of the number at the beginning, right? Because the sequence in which they appear in the string will be the same sequence they appear in the variable. Now let's run that and have a look at that. And you'll find it does the same thing. The first value is like an index position. There we go, exactly the same. If you wanted to rearrange this order and insert them in different orders, then you have to use the first number. But we're only interested in the format string. Now here's an interesting thing, right? This one here has 2 decimal places, and they all have 2 decimal places, and they all are given their value that goes in. Now Matthew then had, let's just do a really big one. I'm going to put in here 7 and ask the question, what happens if I put the 7? So here I've got 2 decimal places. I know it's 2 because there's a point. But if I put a 7, so I have 7.2f, what will happen with the output? Let's pay attention and see what happens. And then see if we can work out what's going on here, right? We might need to play around with this a bit so you can see the previous version. Right, I don't think you can see the difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 strings which look almost identical, and we're going to compare them. Okay, S1 is going to be this first one, right, which is just the decimal formats. Get rid of the 7, right? S2 is going to have numbers here, 7 here, let's put 7 here, and let's put 7. Notice it's after the colon. Okay, and there's nothing before the colon because I'm assuming A, B, and C are the sequence the placeholders appear. Okay, so I've got 2 different versions. I'll print the first, and then I'll print the second. Output the second into the shell. Let's have a look and see if we can work out what that 7 does by having a look at what the output looks like, right? So I'm going to run it. Okay. There's obviously a difference between these 2 lines. Can you spot what the difference is? They've both got 2 decimal places, so the 0.2f gives you the number of decimal places. We can experiment with that, okay? We can change that to 3. This one has nothing between the colon and the dot. It's just essentially a 0 there, right? And we are running out of space here, so you can't see it. There we go. Let's keep it all on the line. Can I keep it all on the line? Squeeze over. There we go. Right, so let me just rerun that just to emphasize the fact that there's no 7 in the first statement, it's only in the second. So let's run it again. Shift over so you can see it all in a single line. Right, so we have 2 decimal places, that's all it's done. But what's happened to the one down here? What's all this gap here? Essentially, that number there is padding characters. It pads out what occupies that space. So if you want to pad it out, if you want to line it up, if you want to do other kinds of stuff, you would pad it out and use that. If you don't, and you're happy with that, the first line, then you can control it. Now the issue of using padding characters is, look at this. Let's say I add, I don't know, 6 decimal places for each of the statements, right? And the C has 6 decimal places. It's just run over the line. Okay, this one only has 4. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this one has a lot more, right? So let's replicate that down here. 6, 6, and 6. And can we spot what happens to the output? Right. So let's squeeze it over. And let's run it. Well, first of all, they've got 6 decimal points. That's to be expected. Okay, they look identical to me. Don't they look identical to you? It seems that 7 and 6 are too close, so we need a little bit of exaggeration. So let's make that 10, right? A little bit of exaggeration, make them all 10, and rather than 7, so we can see a difference. There's no difference there. It doesn't really explain or show us anything. And remember, the purpose of these videos is not just to tell you stuff, it's for you to explore stuff in the way that I am in these videos. Look at that. Now we start noticing a difference. This has 10 characters, so it takes the 7 and seems to have padded out the opening ones. This one, the one at the top, is just the 6 decimal places. So the way to understand it, and a good starting point, is that when you format and you want padding characters, that's what you would use. Now, when you look through the lecture notes, what you'll notice is that Matthew will have indexes here in some examples and others not. And there are some other little interesting subtleties here. He's got a less than or a greater than 12. What I would recommend you do with these exercises, rather than I go through it and spend a long time in a video, is you play with it. You play with it, experiment, and try to get the code to explain itself to you. Okay? So don't assume that I need to just give you the answer. Assume that you ask the environment, what are you doing? And then you play with it and it will give you a response.